obligations in relation to the provision of aid and other services to Gaza in the context of a binding determination by a competent organ of the United Nations, being the court itself, that there exists a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide, and that Israel must ensure humanitarian aid and basic services in that situation. Despite Israel's objections, there is nothing to prevent the court advising on the obligations flowing from that situation in these proceedings. On the contrary, given that what is an issue is at the very least a situation of a risk of a violation of a peremptory norm of an erga omnes nature, the court could itself risk, I quote, failing in the discharge of its judicial functions if it did not declare that there is an obligation, especially upon members of the United Nations, to bring that situation to an end quote, as the court underscored in the South West Africa case. In the context of what UNRWA's Commissioner General has called, I quote, one of the darkest times for our common humanity that we vowed would not happen again, end quote, the court might well consider it particularly important to remind all states again, as it did a year ago in Nicaragua versus Germany, of their international obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as well as under other binding rules of international law. That brings me to the fourth and penultimate issue, Israel's violations of UN resolutions and the orders of this court. Applying the court's reasoning in South West Africa, there is no doubt that the 4 Security Council resolutions addressing the current situation in Gaza are binding decisions pursuant to Article 25 of the Charter, having regard to their subject matter, their imperative language, and the discussions leading to them. Those discussions include the Secretary-General's exceptional triggering in December 2023 of Article 99 of the Charter, the most powerful tool available to him, permitting him to bring to the Security Council, quote, any matter which, in his opinion, may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security, end quote. Israel's continuing failure to comply with those resolutions, with unanimous Resolution 2417, which condemns the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations, and with dozens of other Security Council resolutions since its admission to the United Nations, constitute repeated violations of Charter Article 25, reflecting a fundamental rejection of the Security Council's authority. Israel has similarly defied numerous General Assembly resolutions, including those calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, setting out the modalities for the implementation of this Court's 2024 advisory opinion, and, I quote, strongly deploring the continued and total disregard and breaches by the Government of Israel of its obligations under the Charter. End quote. Israel continues to defy Resolution 194 concerning the right of return of Palestinian refugees, with which it unequivocally undertook to comply on being admitted to UN membership, and Resolution ES 1024, demanding that Palestinians displaced during Israel's occupation be allowed to return home, as stipulated by this court in its 2024 opinion. Israel has also repeatedly violated Charter Article 94.1 by failing to comply with this court's binding orders in South Africa versus Israel. Israel's Prime Minister has rejected the court's authority, asserting that, I quote, nobody will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else. Just 12 days ago, its Defence Minister declared, in defiance of this court's orders, that, I quote, Israel's policy is clear, and no humanitarian aid is about to enter Gaza. In violation of the court's order to maintain open land crossing points, in particular the Rafah crossing, previously described by the UN High Commissioner as, quote, the symbolic lifeline for 2.3 million people in Gaza, Israel has closed all crossings, and it has turned Rafah itself, once a refuge for almost 1.5 million displaced Palestinians, into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The slide on your screens, reflective of the general tenor of Israeli media since at least October 2023, shows Rafah devastated with the caption, "The annihilation of Rafah is complete," alongside an Israeli flag and a flexed bicep. Plans are reportedly underway for Israel to annex 75 square kilometers of Rafah, 1/5 of Gaza, to Israel's so-called buffer zone, permanently. This, together with Israel's continuing maritime blockade, cuts Gaza and its people off from direct aid and assistance and from the rest of the world. In further violation of the court's orders, Israel continues to block UN-mandated investigatory bodies from Gaza while destroying and burying evidence of its crimes. Despite the extraordinary efforts of Palestinian journalists, who are themselves repeatedly targeted and killed, so much remains undocumented. As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, "I shudder to think of what will still be revealed about the horrors that have taken place in this narrow strip of land." Simultaneously, Israel obstructs external investigations. It does so while its officials denounce the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN Human Rights Council itself as, quote, "a propaganda mouthpiece for terrorist organizations and anti-Semitic Israel haters engaged in blood libels," and calls for the Council to be, quote, "removed from this earth." And so to my final submission concerning the principle of good faith, one of the United Nations bedrock principles set out in Article 2.2 of the Charter. It provides, "All members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfil in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present Charter." The obligation, reaffirmed in the Declaration on Friendly Relations, was described by the court in the nuclear test case as, quote, "one of the basic principles governing the creation and performance of legal obligations, whatever their source," end quote. It reflects not only the maxim of pacta sunt servanda, but also that of qui habet commode, fere debet honora. Whomever receives the advantages must also bear the responsibilities. Israel is failing to fulfill its charter responsibilities in good faith. Its violations of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, its attacks on the United Nations and on UN officials' property and premises, its deliberate obstruction of the organization's work, and its attempt to destroy an entire UN subsidiary organ are unprecedented in the history of the organization. They evidence a fundamental repudiation by Israel of its charter obligations, owed both to the organization and to all UN members, and of the international rule of law. They are antithetical to the actions of a peace-loving state. Israel's very submissions to this court violate its obligations to cooperate with the UN in good faith, advancing allegations for which Israel has persistently failed to provide credible evidence. This is notwithstanding the Secretary-General's call on Israel, quote, "to refrain from such misrepresentations," end quote, given how very damaging they are to the United Nations. But for Israeli officials, damage to the United Nations appears to be the point. Their attacks are not limited to UNRWA or indeed the UN Human Rights Council. Israel has declared the Secretary-General of the United Nations himself persona non grata in Israel, accusing him of being, quote, "an official Hamas spokesperson engaged in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel conduct." Israeli officials demand his resignation, labelling his triggering of Charter Article 99 and his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, quote, "a danger to world peace." Senior Israeli officials level similar accusations at the United Nations itself as an organisation, denouncing it as, quote, "a swamp of anti-Semitic bile, an accomplice to terrorists, and a stain on humanity," Israeli officials have even sought to discredit this court, calling it, quote, an anti-Semitic court comprising judges from Muslim dictatorships, which has been manipulated and weaponized in the persecution of the Jewish people. As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, "The international order is crumbling in a repetition of the horrors that led to the establishment of the United Nations and in violation of commitments to prevent their occurrence. The attacks on UNRWA are an integral part of this disintegration," end quote. Not stopping at UNRWA, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations itself has demanded that the entire UN and, quote, its corrupt courts, the ICC and the ICJ, must be defunded, end quote. In addition to seeking to destroy the protective application of international law to the Palestinian people, Israel appears set on destroying the very international framework created to ensure compliance with international law and accountability for its breach, with profound consequences that reverberate far beyond Palestine and Palestinians. If these venerable institutions are to survive, and if, in the words of the UN Relief Chief, quote, "the basic principles of law still count," the international community must act while it can to uphold them, end quote. Mr. President, members of the Court, the international community is so acting in seeking the Court's advice on these matters, having regard to the Court's prior vital, unwavering reaffirmation of international law in its 2024 advisory opinion. Mindful of the former Secretary-General's description of the United Nations as, quote, "the hope and home of all humankind, with the Charter at its compass," end quote, the State of Palestine respectfully calls on this Court to provide this further advisory opinion urgently to reset that compass in the continuing desperate hope that international law might finally prevail. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges.
Mr. President, members of the Court, I thank you for your kind attention, and I ask you to now call Professor Imseis.
I thank Ms. Nijali. I now give the floor to Mr. Adri Imseis. You have the floor, sir.
Members of the Court, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the State of Palestine and the Palestinian people. I have been given the task of addressing the issue of UNRWA, and to that end, I should like to make 3 points. First, for context, I will discuss the unique historical and operational importance of UNRWA. Second, I will demonstrate both why and how Israel has set upon to destroy the agency. And third, I will discuss Israel's legal obligations towards UNRWA, which this Court has urgently requested to affirm by the vast majority of states and international organizations in these proceedings. First, the context. UNRWA's mandate is an essential element of what the Court has twice recognized as the permanent responsibility of the United Nations for the question of Palestine. This responsibility originates in the unsuccessful attempt by the General Assembly to partition Palestine, and without the consent of the Palestinian people, in 1947, and the ensuing 1948 Nakba, during which between 750,000 and 900,000 Palestinians were forcibly exiled from that part of Palestine that became Israel. In Resolution 302 of 8 December 1949, the General Assembly recognized that continued assistance for the relief of the Palestine refugees is necessary to prevent conditions of starvation and distress among them, and to further conditions of peace and stability. UNRWA was created to provide direct relief and works programs to the refugees until their plight was resolved in accordance with international law. The Assembly therefore determined that UNRWA's mandate was to be discharged without prejudice to the right of the Palestine refugees to return, to restitution, and to compensation in accordance with Resolution 194 of 11 December 1948. But these rights, Mr. President, have never been allowed to be realized. Indeed, with the Israeli occupation of the rest of Palestine in 1967, another 250,000 to 300,000 Palestinians were forcibly exiled and became dependent on UNRWA. And the conditions of starvation and distress have not only continued over the years to varying degrees, but as the court knows only too well, since October 2023, they have gathered a pace never before seen. In essence, it is because of Israel's prolonged violation of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to return to self-determination, indeed to freedom, that the need for UNRWA is as pressing today, if not more so, than it was in 1949. The General Assembly agrees with this assessment. It has continuously renewed UNRWA's mandate with overwhelming support, insisting that until the Palestine refugees realize their rights under international law, UNRWA must remain in place. Operationally, UNRWA provides education, health, relief and social services, and during emergencies, humanitarian aid. And generations of Palestinians have been sustained by these quasi-governmental services in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory. Uniquely, UNRWA's services are directly delivered by thousands of personnel, the vast majority of whom are themselves registered Palestine refugees with the agency. In the occupied Palestinian territory, the number of these staff literally dwarf that of other UN personnel by orders of magnitude, possessing decades of experience, expertise, and all-important community trust. And for these reasons, the necessity of UNRWA is indisputable. The sheer scope of continued Israeli violations of Israeli rights, or rather of Palestinian rights, forgive me, including the right to the unhindered provision of urgently needed humanitarian supplies essential for their survival, as well as the right for basic services, humanitarian and developmental assistance in support of their right to self-determination, renders UNRWA absolutely vital. As recognized by the General Assembly in the referral resolution, no organization can replace or substitute the agency's capacity or mandate. Mr. President, the Secretary General agrees. He states that UNRWA is indispensable in delivering essential services to Palestinians, and that UNRWA is the backbone of the United Nations humanitarian relief operations in Gaza. This conclusion is shared by other UN and humanitarian agencies operating in Palestine, who rely on UNRWA's unmatched operational infrastructure, partnership, and support. It is also shared by nearly all participants in these proceedings, including China, which has referred to UNRWA as indispensable and irreplaceable, both Mexico and Luxembourg, which have each called UNRWA unique and irreplaceable, and Algeria, which has labeled UNRWA the cornerstone of the humanitarian assistance in occupied Palestinian territory. In his written statement, the Secretary General provided incontrovertible empirical evidence in support of this position. I quote, "Since October 2023, UNRWA has supported nearly 2.3 million affected individuals in Gaza with food, health care, and shelter. It has distributed food aid to around 1.9 million people and provided more than 60% of primary health care services in Gaza. Furthermore, UNRWA has sheltered hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons in more than 100 schools and continues to deliver psychosocial support and primary health consultations. Between 7 October 2023 and 19 January 2025, UNRWA facilitated over 7